I'm talking about uterine rupture. I can't possibly get into all the details here, but if you have had a previous cesarean and would like a vaginal birth, then two excellent resources are the International Cesarean Awareness Network, ICAN, and VBAC Facts. There are also additional resources at the back of this book. One thing you absolutely need to know about VBAC is that it's not a procedure. VBAC is the default outcome when you don't schedule a surgery or consent to a repeat cesarean. Sadly, a lot of people seem to have forgotten that labor will start on its own if you're given enough time, and even if your uterus is scarred, it doesn't mean you can't have a physiological birth without intervention. I have served women who have had multiple cesareans and helped them go on to have vaginal births. In fact, one of my first inspirations was my friend Wendy. Wendy had 3 previous cesareans. She was an older mother and deemed too fat by many of the doctors she consulted about having her 4th baby naturally. They all told her that it was too dangerous, citing a risk of uterine rupture as the main concern. She was told the percentage that the risk increased and the fact that she was 3 times more likely to have complications, but what her doctor hadn't counted on was Wendy actually knowing the numbers. This is what I encourage you to do. Know your numbers and start educating yourself on the risks before you talk to a medical professional. This is especially important if you are planning a vaginal birth after multiple cesareans, because the medical system will do anything they can to talk you out of it. You also need to be aware of all your rights. You might have made some choices or agreed to certain exams because you didn't know you could decline them. You might have been told that it was policy, and as a first-time mom, you didn't know that you could question it. It's not your fault, and now you know better, so you won't fall for those lines again. Never let anyone make you feel guilty for saying no. If they do, then they aren't the right people to support you. Finally, you need to start researching your options. There might have been things you overlooked before that you can explore for this pregnancy. Don't rule out home birth just because you think it's not allowed. Don't assume that because you had 1 or more cesareans that you are doomed to have another cesarean. Remember, you get to decide, not them. Unfortunately, knowing your rights and your true risk levels for interventions isn't enough, but it's still a start in the right direction. The more you discover about how birth works and why it didn't work last time, the more you'll be able to plan differently this time around. You'll also be more informed of the risks, and that will allow you to have a clearer picture of what your backup plans might look like. Journal exercise 2.2. Make sure that as you follow the questions for getting the right education, that you also include these as well. And as a reminder, the questions for the right education can be found either in the previous chapter for first-time moms, or you can go to empoweringmomsbirth.com/extras and get the whole list. Choose your safest spaces. I've already touched on choosing your environment for learning and support, so I won't repeat myself here. You will want to be extra careful if you desire a vaginal birth after cesarean, because mom groups can be brutal. For this reason, you might want to skip the mainstream mom groups and find a good VBAC group, preferably one that also includes moms planning a home birth after cesarean, also known as an HBAC. Home births are very low intervention, so you'll get a lot more of an idea of what you could expect in your labor, and you'll be able to see that you don't have to agree to a lot of interventions and monitoring in order to have a VBAC. It's also helpful to join groups where there is a focus on true physiological birth, and even if you're not planning on birthing at home, having information on home birth will still do a lot to dispel your fears and give you a sense of control. Why home birth? Because if your goal is to avoid unnecessary interventions, then you are going to want to labor at home as long as possible. And sometimes that means you won't end up getting to the hospital. This is what happened to my friend Christine. She had planned to birth in the hospital, because our local health authority was very restrictive and didn't allow home birth after cesarean. She knew it would be a fight, and she just didn't feel up to arguing with anyone. In the end, though, she didn't have to. Her baby decided for her. Christine had never experienced a physiological labor, so she was underwhelmed by the intensity of her contractions. She didn't realize until much later, after her waters released, that she had been in active labor the whole time. She'd thought it was almost too easy compared to what she'd endured in her previous induction. As her contractions got closer together, her doula suggested it was time to head to the hospital. Christine didn't make it out her front door. Her waters released and her daughter was coming. They called the midwife, and moments later, she arrived at the house and informed Christine that they could still make it to the hospital. Christine decided that if she had to get on the bed again, that she wasn't going anywhere. And so Christine birthed her daughter in her living room. I'm sharing this story with you because I want you to know one thing. Wherever you plan to give birth, you can change your mind. You might choose to birth at home, but then decide that you would rather go to the hospital. Or you might think that because no midwife will support you at home, that you have to go to the hospital, but wind up having a fast birth at home instead. Knowing where you feel safest is important, as is taking an honest look at the policies of particular hospitals and recognizing their limitations. Some are more likely to intervene and push their fear onto you than others. Sometimes the idea of setting foot back in that same hospital can trigger that fear and anxiety all over again. And many moms I have known have told me that they would sooner birth unassisted than go back there. Take Jenny for an example here. She knew that going back to the hospital that traumatized her would not be something she could do. The easy solution would have been home birth. However, Jenny really did want to have the option of the hospital should she need additional monitoring for her blood pressure. In her case, we needed to come up with some safer places for her to birth. Fortunately, she didn't need to travel more than 20 minutes out of town to a smaller hospital that was more in line with her birth plans and was willing to see her as the decision maker in her care. This is where the right environment is extremely important, especially if you are birthing after one or more cesareans. While the typical advice to avoid an unwanted cesarean is to go in pushing, I can tell you from experience that is not a solid plan. Midwives and doulas have shared stories of their clients who went into the hospital where they had been told they were not allowed to birth vaginally. These women were bullied, threatened, lied to, and even forced to have a cesarean they didn't want or need. If the hospital you are planning to birth in says they don't support VBAC, vaginal breech birth, or vaginal birth with twins, believe them. Sure, you might be able to find a loophole and stand your ground to do it, but do you really want to have to fight during your birth? But what if there are no supportive hospitals in your area? This is when you have to really ask yourself, how badly do you want to avoid that pressure? You may need to travel. You might need to consider paying an underground midwife or birth attendant. You might even need to do it yourself or call in assistance at the last possible second. Seeking out the right birth location could mean you need to travel outside of your city or even further, like Wendy did for her VBAC after 3 cesareans. No one in our health service area was willing to allow her to birth her baby vaginally, so she decided to travel an hour out of town to our neighboring health authority in Vancouver Coastal Health and birth at BC Women's Hospital instead. Other women have booked hotels in other cities, even traveled to different states in the US, just to ensure they could get the respectful care they deserved. None of these scenarios is ideal, but until we can change the way that hospitals operate when it comes to maternity care, drastic measures sometimes need to be taken to prove to yourself and to others that the kind of birth you want is actually possible. People only believe VBAC at home is dangerous because the medical system keeps telling people it's dangerous. But the more stories circulate that mothers have had a vaginal birth at home after one or even multiple cesareans, the more that narrative will be questioned. The more something is questioned, the more people start asking for more options within the system. But that's a whole other subject I could get into. All right, so now we have your journal exercises. As a reminder, you just go to empoweringmomsbirth.com/extras, and you can get the whole list as well as all the bonuses that come with this book. So here's what you need to ask yourself as you plan for your right environment. Number one, when thinking about birthing in a safe place where your wishes are respected, what comes to mind? Number two, where can you find yourself freaking out the most or fearing a repeat of what happened last time? Number three, are there alternative places you could birth outside of what you've already experienced? Number four, if you truly need to birth in the hospital, what conditions would need to be in place for you to feel safe and supported there? Number five, what do you need to know to feel comfortable laboring at home as long as possible? Are you prepared for an accidental home birth should it happen? Once you know your level of comfort when it comes to where you feel safest to birth, you're already well on your way to plan your next step.